They said no one survived the North Wing more than a day. They said the Alphaking was a monster who'd forgotten how to be a man. They said a human could never stand beside a shifter king. They were wrong. This is the story of Jane, a woman the world refused to see, who became the queen that a broken kingdom desperately needed. This is a story of love found in darkness, courage born from desperation, and a bond that would change an entire world. But before we begin, if you love stories of forbidden romance, unlikely heroes, and heart-stopping moments that will leave you breathless, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because you won't want to miss what happens next. Trust me. This story will have you on the edge of your seat. Now, let me take you to Oakhaven, where our story begins on the coldest night of winter. The city of Oakhaven was a place of two worlds. In the upper districts, shifter nobles lived in warmth and luxury, their grand estates lit by golden lamplight, their tables overflowing with food and wine. They moved through life with the certainty of those who had never known hunger, never known fear, never known what it meant to be invisible. But in the lower city, where the cobblestones were cracked and the buildings leaned against each other like old men too tired to stand alone, humans like Jane knew a different truth. They were the forgotten ones, the servants, the laborers, the people who kept the kingdom running while remaining unseen, unheard, and unremarkable. Jane had been invisible her entire life, and she'd made peace with it. At 23, she'd learned that invisibility was a kind of armor. If no one saw you, no one could hurt you. If you kept your head down and your mouth shut, you could survive. And survival was all that mattered. Her mother was sick. A cough that had started in autumn and had never left, growing worse with each passing week. The medicines were expensive, far beyond what Jane could afford on her servants' wages. Her younger brother Thomas was only 14, too young to work in the factories, too small to labor in the docks. Everything depended on Jane. So when Mrs. Hemlock, the stern head housekeeper of the royal palace, called her into the servants' hall that frozen December morning, Jane knew better than to refuse whatever assignment was coming. "You're being reassigned," Mrs. Hemlock said, her voice clipped and cold. She didn't look at Jane. She never did. Humans weren't worth the effort of eye contact. The North Wing. The room went silent. Every servant in the hall turned to stare. Jane felt their eyes on her like physical weight, pressing down, suffocating. She saw pity in some faces, relief in others. They were grateful it wasn't them. The North Wing? Jane's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "But I thought—" "You thought correctly. No servant has lasted more than a day." Mrs. Hemlock's thin lips pressed into a disapproving line. "The king is difficult, temperamental. The last girl ran out crying after he threw a dinner tray at the wall." Jane swallowed hard. "And the one before that?" "Quit after 3 hours. Said she'd rather starve in the streets than face his temper again." Mrs. Hemlock finally looked at Jane, and her gaze was utterly devoid of sympathy. "You're the last available. If you refuse, you're dismissed from palace service entirely. No references, no severance. In other words, accept or watch your mother die and your brother starve." Jane felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not quite fear, not quite resignation. Something harder. Something that tasted like determination mixed with desperation. "I'll do it," she said quietly. Mrs. Hemlock looked almost surprised. "You understand what you're agreeing to? The king's rage is legendary. He's isolated himself in the North Wing for 3 years. He barely eats, barely sleeps, and he certainly doesn't tolerate incompetence or questions." "I understand." "Then report at sunset. Take the servants' stairs to the 3rd floor, turn left at the portrait of the old king, and continue until you reach the last door. Knock once. Leave the tray. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not look him in the eye. Do not, under any circumstances, try to engage him in conversation." Mrs. Hemlock's voice dropped to something almost resembling concern. "And girl, don't expect kindness. That part of him died long ago. Sunset came too quickly. Jane climbed the servant's stairs with the tray balanced on her hip. Roasted meat, fresh bread, winter vegetables, and a pot of strong tea. The food smelled delicious, but her stomach was twisted too tight with nerves to feel hungry. The North Wing was exactly as the rumors described. Silent, dark, and heavy with the weight of abandonment. Dust motes floated in the dying light that filtered through tall windows. Portraits of previous kings stared down from the walls with stern, judging faces. The air smelled of old smoke, pine, and something else. Something wild and indefinable that made the hair on Jane's arms stand up. It was the scent of a predator. She reached the last door and hesitated, her hand raised to knock. From inside, she could hear nothing. No movement, no sound, just an oppressive, waiting silence. Jane knocked once, as instructed. Nothing. She waited, counting her heartbeats. When she reached 30, she carefully turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room beyond was massive, a study that could have held her entire family's apartment 3 times over. Bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked ancient and untouched. An enormous desk sat near the window, buried under mountains of papers, maps, and official documents. The fireplace was cold, the ashes days old, and in the corner, half hidden in shadow, sat a man. No, not just a man. A king. Even in the darkness, even slouched in a chair with exhaustion written into every line of his body, King Henry radiated power. He was tall. She could tell even sitting down, with broad shoulders and a presence that seemed to fill the entire room. His dark hair was too long, falling across his face in a way that suggested he hadn't bothered with a barber in months. His clothes were expensive but rumpled, as if he'd been wearing them for days. "Leave it," King Henry said without looking up. His voice was rough, like gravel and smoke. "And go." This was the moment. This was when Jane should have obeyed, set down the tray, and fled like every servant before her. But she looked at him, really looked, and saw something that stopped her in her tracks. He wasn't eating out of cruelty or madness. He was drowning. The papers on his desk weren't just official documents. They were reports. Tax records, petitions, complaints, requests for aid. She could see notations in his handwriting, careful calculations, crossed-out budget lines. He was trying to solve problems that had no solutions, trying to help people with resources that didn't exist. And he was doing it alone, in the dark, without rest or comfort or a single kind word. Jane set the tray down on a side table. Then, instead of leaving, she crossed to the window and drew back the heavy curtains, letting in the last rays of sunset. "What are you doing?" King Henry's voice held a warning edge. "Opening the curtains," Jane said simply. She moved to the fireplace and knelt, examining the cold ashes. "And building you a fire. It's freezing in here." "I gave you an order." "You did." Jane didn't look at him as she arranged kindling in the fireplace, her hands steady despite her racing heart. "You told me to leave the tray." "I did." "You didn't say I couldn't make the room livable first?" There was a long, dangerous pause. "You're human," he said, and there was something in his voice she couldn't identify. Surprise, maybe. Or confusion. "I am." "Humans don't talk back to me." "Maybe they should." Jane struck a match and lit the kindling, watching the flames catch and grow. "When did you last eat a full meal?" "That's none of your concern." "When did you last sleep?" I said. "And when?" Jane turned to face him fully for the first time, meeting his eyes despite every instinct screaming at her to look away. "Did you last have a conversation with someone who wasn't afraid of you?" The king stared at her. In the growing firelight, she could finally see his face clearly. He was younger than she'd expected. Perhaps 30, though exhaustion and stress made him look older. His eyes were the color of amber, wolf gold and haunted. His face was handsome in a harsh, angular way, but it was the expression that caught her attention. He looked stunned, as if no one had asked him a personal question in years. You should be afraid of me, he said quietly. Everyone else is. I know. Jane stood, brushing ash from her hands. But fear won't help you eat. Fear won't help you sleep. And fear certainly won't help you solve. She gestured at the desk. Whatever impossible problem you're trying to solve in the dark by yourself. Why do you care? It was a fair question. Jane considered lying, considered saying something noble and self-sacrificing. But something about the way he looked at her, really looked at her, as if she was actually visible for the first time in her life, made her choose honesty. Because I need this job, she said bluntly. Because my mother is sick and my brother is too young to work, and if I lose this position, they'll die. So I need you to eat and sleep and stop throwing trays at walls because I can't afford to fail. A startled sound escaped him. Half laugh, half cough, as if he'd forgotten how to do either. At least you're honest. It's all I have. He studied her for a long moment, and Jane forced herself not to fidget under that golden gaze. Finally, he stood, and she realized her estimate had been wrong. He wasn't just tall. He was massive, easily 6.5 feet of solid muscle and barely contained power. He could kill her without effort. She knew it. He knew it. And yet, when he walked past her to the tray, his movements were careful, almost gentle, as if he was trying not to frighten her. What's your name? He asked, picking up a piece of bread. Jane. Just Jane? Just Jane. I'm nobody important. He looked at her again, and this time there was something almost sad in his expression. Everyone keeps telling me that, he said softly. About themselves, about others. Everyone is nobody important. But if everyone is nobody, Jane, then who exactly is running my kingdom? She had no answer for that. He ate the bread slowly, methodically, like someone who'd forgotten what hunger felt like. Then he returned to his desk, to his impossible papers and his unsolvable problems. You can go, he said, but his voice had lost its sharp edge. Jane moved toward the door, then paused. I'll return in the morning, with breakfast. I didn't ask. I know, but you need to eat. And Your Majesty? She looked back at him. My name is Jane, not girl, not human, not servant. Jane. I'd appreciate it if you used it. She left before he could respond, closing the door softly behind her. In the silence of the North Wing, Henry, the feared Alphaking of Oakhaven, the monster that noblemen whispered about and servants fled from, stood alone in his study and smiled for the first time in 3 years. But he was no longer quite so alone. And for the first time in years, King Henry felt something he'd thought lost forever. Hope. Are you hooked yet? Because this is just the beginning. Jane has no idea that her simple act of kindness is about to change everything. Not just for her, but for an entire kingdom. If you're invested in this story, if you want to see where this impossible romance leads, do me a favor. Hit that like button right now. Show me you're here for the journey. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? This channel is all about stories that will make you feel, make you think, and keep you coming back for more. Now, let's continue. Because tomorrow morning, Jane returns to the North Wing and everything begins to shift. Jane returned the next morning as promised, carrying a breakfast tray through the quiet corridors of the North Wing. She'd barely slept. All night. She'd replayed their conversation in her mind, half convinced she'd wake up to find herself dismissed, or worse, dragged before the king to face punishment for her insolence. But when she opened the door to his study, she found something she hadn't expected. He was asleep. Not in his bed. She doubted he'd seen his bed in weeks. But at his desk, slumped over his papers with his head pillowed on his folded arms. In sleep, the harsh lines of his face had softened. He looked younger, vulnerable, almost peaceful. Jane set the tray down silently and stood there for a moment, just watching him. This was the monster everyone feared? This exhausted man who worked himself to collapse trying to help people who would never thank him? She should wake him. She should leave. She should do anything except stand here staring. But before she could decide, his eyes opened. For a moment, they just looked at each other. His amber eyes were clouded with sleep, unguarded in a way she suspected they rarely were. "Jane," he said, and her name in his rough morning voice did something strange to her chest. "Good morning, Your Majesty." "Henry?" She blinked. "I'm sorry?" "My name is Henry." He sat up slowly, wincing as his spine protested. "You asked me to use your name. It seems only fair that you use mine." "I can't." "You can." He stood and moved to the tray, examining the breakfast she'd brought. "In this room, at least. Out there." He gestured vaguely toward the door, toward the rest of the palace. "I'm Your Majesty? Or the King? Or that temperamental bastard in the North Wing? But here, I'm just Henry. Just Henry. As if there was anything just about him." "All right," Jane said carefully. "Henry." He smiled again, that rare, precious expression that transformed his entire face. "See? That wasn't so hard." Over the next hour, something shifted between them. Henry ate while Jane began to organize his study, not intrusively, but practically. She opened windows to air out the staleness. She gathered scattered papers into neat piles. She didn't touch the important documents on his desk, but she did remove old teacups, empty plates, and the detritus of weeks spent in isolation. And while she worked, they talked. Not about anything important at first. The weather, the quality of the breakfast, the fact that the North Wing needed more firewood. But gradually, carefully, the conversation deepened. "Why do you do this?" Jane asked, gesturing at the papers on his desk. "Stay up here alone. Working yourself to death?" Henry was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the city below. "Because it's my job, my responsibility." "But you have advisors. The council cares about politics and power and making sure their own packs are taken care of." His voice went hard. "They don't care about the humans in the lower city who can't afford food. They don't care about the farmers who lost everything to the early frost. They don't care about anything that doesn't directly benefit them. And you do?" He looked at her, and the raw honesty in his eyes stole her breath. "I have to. Because if I don't, who will?" Jane understood that feeling. She lived it every day. The weight of being the only thing standing between the people you loved and complete disaster. "That's why you're alone," she said softly. "Isn't it? Not because you're angry or cruel, but because you care too much, and no one else does." Henry didn't answer, but the look on his face was answer enough. Jane made a decision that would change both their lives. She crossed to his desk, pulled up a second chair, and sat down. "Show me," she said. "Show you what?" "The problems you're trying to solve. Maybe a fresh perspective will help." "You're a servant, not an advisor." "I'm a human who lives in the lower city. I know things your noble advisors don't." She met his eyes steadily. "Show me, Henry. Let me help." And so he did. For the next 2 hours, they bent over maps and budget reports together. Jane couldn't read as well as he could. Her education had been limited. But she could do numbers, and she knew the realities of life in the streets. When Henry proposed increased taxes to fund improvements, Jane showed him why that would cause riots. When he suggested closing the northern gate to save on guard wages, she explained how that would cut off the market district and starve half the lower city. But she also offered solutions: alternative trade routes, local businesses that could partner with the crown, community-organized systems that required less overhead. Henry listened to every word, taking notes, asking questions, treating her input as if it came from a trained scholar rather than an undereducated servant. And Jane felt something she'd never experienced before. She felt seen. Not as a servant, not as a human, but as a person whose thoughts mattered, whose existence had value, whose words deserved attention. It was intoxicating, terrifying, wonderful. By the time noon approached, they'd made actual progress on 3 separate problems that had been plaguing Henry for weeks. "You should go," Henry said reluctantly, glancing at the clock, "before someone comes looking for you." Jane stood, smoothing her simple dress. "I'll return this evening, with dinner." "Jane." He hesitated, and for the first time she saw uncertainty in his powerful frame. "Thank you. For all of this." "You're welcome, Henry." She was halfway to the door when his voice stopped her. "Jane, earlier you said you were nobody important." She looked back at him. His amber eyes held hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "You were wrong." Days turned into weeks, and weeks into something neither of them wanted to name. Jane's morning and evening visits became the highlights of Henry's day. She brought more than food. She brought life back into the North Wing, back into his carefully controlled existence. She learned his moods, the subtle shifts in his expression that meant he was frustrated or tired or wrestling with a problem he couldn't solve. She learned to read his silence, to know when he needed conversation and when he needed quiet companionship. And Henry, careful, controlled, isolated Henry, began to open up in ways he'd never imagined possible. He told her about his parents, both killed in a border skirmish when he was 22, thrust onto a throne he wasn't ready for. He told her about the weight of leadership, the impossible choices, the way every decision meant someone suffered. He told her about the loneliness. "Everyone sees the crown," he said one evening, sitting by the fire while Jane mended a tear in his shirt, something he'd never have allowed anyone else to do. "No one sees the man underneath." "I see him," Jane said quietly, focused on her stitching. "Do you?" She looked up and found him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. "Yes, I see someone who works himself to exhaustion because he cares. Someone who carries the weight of an entire kingdom on his shoulders and never complains. Someone who deserves better than this isolation. Maybe I deserve exactly this." His voice was rough. "Maybe this is what happens when you're born a monster." Jane set down the shirt and moved to kneel in front of his chair, taking his large hands in her smaller ones. The touch sent electricity through both of them, but she didn't pull away. "You're not a monster, Henry. You're a man doing an impossible job with no support and no kindness and no one to tell you that you're enough exactly as you are." His hands tightened on hers. "Jane, you are enough," she said fiercely. "The kingdom is broken not because of you, but because of systems and prejudices and selfishness that existed long before you took the throne. You're trying to fix in 3 years what should have been prevented over generations. And you're doing it alone. That doesn't make you a monster. It makes you extraordinary." Henry stared at her, and something in his carefully constructed walls finally cracked. "How do you do that?" he whispered. "Do what?" "Make me believe that I might be worth something." Jane's heart broke for him. "Oh, Henry, you're worth everything." The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither dared name. Henry's thumb brushed across her knuckles, a touch so gentle it seemed impossible from someone so powerful. "I shouldn't," he said, voice strained. "Shouldn't what?" "Feel this way. About you. You're human. I'm a shifter king. There are laws, traditions, expectations." "I don't care about any of that," Jane said, and realized with a shock that it was true. Somewhere in these weeks, she'd stopped caring about survival and started caring about something far more dangerous. "Do you?" "I should." He raised one hand to cup her face, his touch reverent. "I should care about all of it. I should send you away before this becomes something we can't take back. But Jane, I'm not that strong. Not when it comes to you." "Then don't be strong," she whispered. "Not tonight." He leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. When his lips finally met hers, it was gentle, questioning, almost hesitant, as if he was afraid he might break her. But Jane had never felt less breakable. She kissed him back with all the emotion she'd been holding inside, all the longing and fear and desperate hope. His arms came around her, lifting her effortlessly as he stood, holding her against him as if she was something precious. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Henry rested his forehead against hers. "This is madness," he said. "I know. They'll never accept it. The council, the nobles, the traditionalists. I know. It will be dangerous, for both of us. I know." Jane pulled back enough to meet his eyes. "But Henry, I'd rather have one moment of this, of being seen, of being valued, of being loved, than a lifetime of safe invisibility." "Loved?" His voice cracked on the word. "Yes." She said it without hesitation, without shame. "I love you. I love your terrible schedule and your midnight problem solving and the way you pretend to be a monster when really you're the kindest man I've ever known. I love—" He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Jane felt the last of her defenses crumble. They both knew this couldn't last. They both knew the world outside that door would never allow them this happiness. But for tonight, in the firelight of the North Wing, they let themselves pretend. Reality came crashing back 3 weeks later in the form of Arthur Pemberton, senior member of the King's Council. Jane was in Henry's study, a common occurrence now, when the door burst open without warning. She jumped back from where she'd been leaning over Henry's shoulder, examining a new trade proposal. But it was too late. Arthur's cold eyes had already registered everything. Their proximity, the casual intimacy, the way Henry's hand had automatically moved to steady her. "Your Majesty," Arthur said, voice dripping with barely concealed contempt. "I see the rumors are true." Henry stood slowly, every inch the king now. The warmth that had been in his expression seconds before vanished, replaced by cold authority. "You will knock before entering my private chambers, councilman." "I would have, had I known you were entertaining." The way he said entertaining made Jane's skin crawl. "Jane is my personal servant," Henry said, voice level. "She's attending to her duties." "Interesting duties." Arthur's gaze raked over Jane with open disgust. "I wasn't aware that reading trade proposals was part of a servant's job description, particularly a human servant." "What do you want, Arthur?" Henry's patience was clearly wearing thin. "What I want is to understand why the Alphaking of Oakhaven has been hiding in the North Wing for months, ignoring his counsel, neglecting his duties to the pack, and apparently forming inappropriate attachments to the staff." "My personal life is none of your concern." "It is when it affects the stability of the kingdom." Arthur pulled a document from his coat. "The allied packs are restless. You've been unwed for 3 years, Your Majesty. The succession is uncertain. And now there are whispers, scandalous whispers, about you and a human." Jane felt ice form in her stomach. "Those whispers are unfounded gossip," Henry said, but even Jane could hear the lie. "Are they?" Arthur's smile was cruel. "Then you won't object to the mating ball we've arranged for next month. Every eligible shifter noblewoman in the kingdom will attend. It's time you chose a proper mate, Your Majesty. A queen who can unite the packs, strengthen our alliances, and provide you with an heir." "I haven't agreed to any ball." "The council voted unanimously in your absence. It's already been announced." Arthur moved toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Your Majesty? I'd recommend dismissing your personal servant. For her own safety, of course. Humans can be so fragile, and feelings run high on matters of tradition." The threat was unmistakable. After Arthur left, silence filled the study like poison. "Henry," Jane started. "Don't." He turned away from her, shoulders rigid with tension. "Don't say whatever you're about to say. We knew this would happen eventually. I won't choose one of them." His voice was fierce. "I won't marry some nobleman's daughter who sees me as a political prize and you as something less than human." But you have to. Jane forced the words out past the pain in her chest. Arthur made it clear. If you don't, they'll force a vote of no confidence. They'll remove you from power. Everything you've been working for, all the changes you want to make, it will all be undone. I don't care. Yes, you do. She crossed to him, placing a hand on his back. She felt him shudder at her touch. You care about this kingdom more than anything. More than yourself. More than us. No. He spun to face her, and the raw emotion in his eyes made her want to cry. No, Jane, I'm not giving you up. I can't. Then what do we do? Before he could answer, the door opened again. This time accompanied by a knock, but the visitor clearly hadn't waited for permission. A woman glided into the room, and Jane immediately knew she was looking at everything she wasn't. The newcomer was beautiful, tall and elegant, with long auburn hair and sharp green eyes. She wore a gown that cost more than Jane's family would earn in a year, and she moved with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no in her entire life. Henry, the woman purred, completely ignoring Jane's existence. It's been too long. Isabella? Henry's voice went flat. What are you doing here? I came as soon as I heard about the ball. Father thinks it's a wonderful opportunity. She finally glanced at Jane, and her lip curled in distaste. You there. Fetch me tea. Lady Isabella, Henry said coldly. This is Jane. She serves me directly and takes orders from no one else. Isabella's eyes narrowed. How peculiar. Well, I'm sure you won't mind if I steal your servant's master for a moment. We have so much to discuss before the ball. She linked her arm through Henry's, and Jane saw him stiffen with barely controlled anger. Jane, he said, not breaking eye contact with Isabella. Please wait outside. It wasn't a dismissal. It was protection. Jane understood that. But it didn't make leaving any easier. She stepped into the hallway and closed the door, but not before she heard Isabella's next words, clear and cutting. Really, Henry? A human? I know you've been isolated, but surely you haven't grown that desperate. Things are getting complicated, aren't they? This is where the real test begins. Not just of Jane and Henry's feelings for each other, but of their courage, their convictions, and their willingness to fight for something the world says is impossible. If you're feeling the tension, if your heart is racing for these characters, show some love. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me whose side you're on. Team Jane or Team Isabella? And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time. Trust me, you don't want to miss how this story unfolds. The best part is still coming. Let's get back to Oakhaven, where Jane is about to make a decision that will change everything. The weeks leading up to the mating ball were torture. Jane continued her duties in the North Wing, but everything had changed. Isabella visited daily, always finding excuses to linger, always making subtle comments designed to remind Jane of her place. The other servants whispered. Some pitied her, others mocked her. A few warned her to run before she got hurt. But Jane stayed, because leaving would mean abandoning Henry to face the vultures alone. And because, despite everything, despite the impossibility of their situation, she loved him. Henry was quieter now, the weight of the approaching ball settling over him like a shroud. He barely slept. He barely ate. Jane did what she could to help, but she felt helpless against the political machine grinding them both down. Then, 3 days before the ball, everything changed. Jane entered Henry's study to find him standing by the window, holding a large box wrapped in silver paper. What's that? She asked. Something I need you to trust me about. He turned to face her, and the intensity in his eyes made her heart skip. Open it. Jane approached slowly and lifted the lid. Inside was the most beautiful dress she'd ever seen. It was silver, the color of moonlight on water, made from fabric so fine it seemed to shimmer with its own light. The design was simple but elegant, cut to flatter rather than display, to suggest rather than flaunt. It was a dress fit for a queen. Henry, she breathed. I can't. You can. He moved closer. I need you to wear this to the ball. The ball? Henry, I'm a servant. Servants don't attend the mating ball. You're not just a servant, not to me. He took her hands, his touch warm and solid. I've made a decision, Jane. I'm going to choose you. The world seemed to stop. What? She whispered. At the ball, in front of the council and every noble family in the kingdom, I'm going to reject their acceptable choices and choose you. I'm going to make you my queen. Jane's mind reeled. Henry, that's insane. They'll never accept it. The council will revolt. The noble families will... I don't care. His hands tightened on hers. I've spent 3 years trying to appease them, trying to work within their rules, trying to make everyone happy while slowly dying inside. I'm done, Jane. I'm done being what everyone else wants me to be. I'm going to be who I am, a man who loves a remarkable woman who happens to be human. They could kill me, Jane said bluntly. Arthur practically threatened as much. Which is why I've taken precautions. Henry's voice went hard. I've spent the last 2 weeks calling in every favor I'm owed. The commanders of the Royal Guard are loyal to me. The common people, both human and shifter, are on our side. And I've found some interesting information about certain council members that they'd rather not become public. Henry, I know it's asking everything of you. I know it's dangerous. But Jane... His voice cracked slightly. I can't do this without you. I can't face a lifetime married to someone who sees me as a crown instead of a person. I can't rule this kingdom alongside someone I don't love. I need you. Not just as my queen, but as my partner, my equal, my... Jane kissed him, cutting off his words. When she pulled back, there were tears in her eyes but determination in her voice. Yes. Yes? Yes, I'll wear the dress. Yes, I'll go to the ball. Yes, I'll stand beside you no matter what happens. She smiled through her tears. Yes to all of it, Henry. Because I love you. Because you're worth fighting for. Because if there's even a chance we can build something better, something where humans and shifters are truly equal, then I have to try. Henry pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she didn't care. I don't deserve you, he murmured against her hair. Good thing love isn't about deserving, then. They stood there in the fading afternoon light, two people who should never have met, should never have mattered to each other, holding on as if they could stop the world from tearing them apart. But the world was coming for them, whether they were ready or not. The night of the mating ball arrived like a storm on the horizon, inevitable, terrifying, and beautiful in its own destructive way. Jane had never seen the palace ballroom before. Servants weren't allowed in the grand halls except to clean them when the nobles were absent. But tonight, dressed in her silver gown with her dark hair swept up in a style one of the sympathetic maids had helped her create, she walked through those massive doors like she belonged there. The ballroom was breathtaking. A massive space with soaring ceilings, glittering chandeliers, and walls lined with mirrors that multiplied the crowd into infinity. Hundreds of nobles filled the room, all dressed in their finest, all watching, all waiting to see which woman their king would choose, and what women they were. Isabella stood near the front in a gown of deep emerald that matched her calculating eyes. Beside her were at least 20 other eligible noblewomen, each more beautiful than the last, each from a powerful family, each representing alliances and political advantages. Jane felt every eye in the room turn to her as she entered. The whispers started immediately, spreading like wildfire. That's her. The human. What is she doing here? How dare she? Someone needs to remove her before... But before anyone could act, Henry appeared at the top of the grand staircase. The room fell silent. He wore formal attire, black and silver, the colors of the crown, and he looked every inch the Alphaking. Powerful, commanding, untouchable. But when his eyes found Jane in the crowd, when that hint of a smile touched his lips, he looked like something else entirely. He looked like a man in love. Henry descended the stairs slowly, and Jane watched as every noble woman in the room straightened, preened, prepared themselves to be chosen. Isabella's smile was predatory. Arthur stood with the council, confident in their victory. Henry reached the ballroom floor and began to walk. Past Isabella, past the other noblewomen, past the shocked faces and confused whispers, straight to Jane. He stopped in front of her and held out his hand. "Dance with me?" Jane took his hand, feeling the tremor in her fingers, and let him lead her to the center of the floor. The orchestra, confused but obedient, began to play. They moved together in perfect synchronization, as if they'd been dancing together for years instead of minutes. Jane was acutely aware of every eye watching them, every scandalized gasp, every angry mutter. But in Henry's arms, with his hand warm on her waist and his eyes locked on hers, the rest of the world faded away. "Are you ready?" he murmured so softly only she could hear. "No," she admitted. "Are you?" "Not even a little." He smiled, and it was beautiful and terrified and real. "But let's do it anyway." The music swelled. The dance ended, and Henry turned to face the assembled crowd, still holding Jane's hand. "Lords and ladies of Oakhaven," he said, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "You've gathered here tonight expecting me to choose a mate, a queen, someone to stand beside me and help rule this kingdom." Isabella stepped forward, confidence radiating from every pore. "You expect me to choose based on bloodlines?" Henry continued. "On political alliances, on tradition and precedent, and the way things have always been done." Arthur was smiling now, thinking he'd won. "But I didn't become king to maintain the status quo. I became king to build something better, something fairer, something where every person, shifter and human alike, has value and worth and the chance to be seen." Jane felt Henry's hand tighten on hers. "Which is why I'm choosing Jane." The silence that followed was deafening. Then chaos erupted. "Unacceptable," Arthur roared. "She's human. She has no bloodline, no family, no—" "She has intelligence." Henry cut him off, his voice like steel. "She has courage. She has a heart that sees past prejudice and politics to the people who actually matter. She spent more time helping me govern this kingdom in the last few months than any of you have in the last 3 years." "This is madness." Isabella's beautiful face was twisted with rage. "You can't make a human your queen. The law," Henry said coldly, "says that the Alpha King may choose any mate he deems worthy. It says nothing about species. Check the charter if you don't believe me. I had the palace scholars research it thoroughly." "The Pax will never accept this," another council member sputtered. "They'll revolt." "Some might, others won't, but that's not your decision to make." Henry's voice rang through the ballroom. "I am the Alpha King. I have made my choice. Anyone who cannot accept my authority is welcome to challenge me for it." The threat hung in the air. No one moved. No one dared. Henry was the most powerful shifter in the kingdom, and everyone knew it. But then Isabella stepped forward, her eyes glittering with malice. "I challenge her." The room gasped. "What?" Jane whispered. "Not you, Your Majesty. Her." Isabella pointed at Jane. "The ancient laws are clear. If a mate choice is disputed, the challenger may face the chosen in trial by combat. If I win, your choice is nullified. You must choose another." "No," Henry said immediately. "Absolutely not. I won't—" "It's within her rights," Arthur said, and the satisfaction in his voice was nauseating. "The law is the law, Your Majesty, unless your human refuses the challenge, in which case she's deemed unworthy, and your choice is automatically nullified." It was a trap, a perfect, inescapable trap. Jane felt the walls closing in. She had no training, no shifter strength or speed. She was a human woman who'd spent her life in the lower city, while Isabella was a trained shifter from a warrior family. It was suicide. But if she refused, Henry would lose everything: his choice, his authority, his chance to change the kingdom. Jane looked up at Henry and saw the desperation in his eyes, the silent plea for her to refuse, to save herself, to let him find another way. She smiled at him. I accept the challenge. Jane, no. I accept, she said louder, turning to face Isabella and the entire ballroom. Tomorrow at dawn, trial by combat. I'll face Lady Isabella for the right to stand as Henry's queen. Isabella's smile was cruel. Tomorrow at dawn, then. I'll try to make your death quick, human. Jane didn't sleep that night. How could she? In less than 12 hours, she would face a shifter warrior in combat. A shifter who could move faster, hit harder, and heal quicker than any human could dream of. She sat in Henry's study, their study now, staring at the fire and trying not to think about all the ways she was going to die. Henry paced like a caged animal, his control fraying with each passing minute. We can run, he said for the 20th time. Pack now. Leave Oakhaven. Start over somewhere else. And abandon the kingdom? Abandon everyone you've been trying to help? Jane shook her head. You know we can't do that. Then I'll fight her myself. Challenge Isabella to a duel for insulting my mate. That would undermine everything you're trying to prove. That power comes from strength alone. Jane stood and crossed to him, taking his face in her hands. Henry, listen to me. I know this is insane. I know the odds. But I have to try. Not just for us, but for every human in this kingdom who's ever been told they don't matter. They aren't enough, they're less than. I can't lose you. His voice broke. Jane, I just found you. I can't... You won't lose me. She tried to sound confident, even though fear was eating her alive. I'm not going to win through strength. I'm going to win through strategy. What strategy? She's faster, stronger, but maybe not smarter, maybe not more patient. Jane had been thinking about this all night, turning it over in her mind. Shifters rely on their natural advantages. They don't need to think tactically because they usually don't need to. But I've been fighting to survive my entire life. I know how to use what little I have. Henry pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he could keep her safe through sheer force of will. Promise me something. Anything. If it goes badly, if you're injured, if Isabella is about to kill you, yield. I don't care about the consequences. Your life is worth more than any crown. Jane pressed her face against his chest, breathing in his scent of pine and smoke and safety. I promise. It was a lie, and they both knew it. The trial by combat was held in the palace courtyard as the sun rose over Oakhaven. It seemed like the entire kingdom had turned out to watch. The courtyard was packed with nobles, commoners, humans, and shifters. Some had come to support Jane. Most had come to watch her die. Jane stood on one side of the marked circle, wearing simple fighting clothes borrowed from the palace guards. No armor. That would slow her down. No weapons. Those were forbidden in trial by combat. Just her wits, her determination, and a plan that was probably going to get her killed. Across the circle, Isabella stretched like a cat, confidence radiating from every movement. She'd already partially shifted, her eyes gone wolf gold, her nails elongated into claws. Henry stood at the edge of the circle, surrounded by the royal guard. He looked like he was dying inside. Arthur read the formal challenge, his voice carrying over the silent crowd. Trial by combat, as witnessed by the Crown and Council. The match continues until one participant yields, is incapacitated, or is killed. Do both parties accept these terms? I accept, Isabella purred. I accept, Jane said, and her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that. Then begin. Isabella moved. She was fast, impossibly fast. 1 second she was across the circle, the next she was on Jane, claws slashing for her throat. But Jane had been expecting it. She'd been watching Isabella all morning, studying her movements, and she'd seen the telltale tensing before the attack. Jane dropped and rolled, feeling the wind of Isabella's claws pass inches from her neck. She came up running, putting distance between them, The crowd gasped. They'd expected Jane to be dead within seconds. Running? Isabella laughed. That's your strategy? You can't run forever, human. She was right. Jane's stamina was already flagging, her breath coming hard. But she didn't need to run forever. She just needed to survive long enough for her plan to work. Isabella attacked again, and again. Each time, Jane dodged by the narrowest margin, using every trick she'd learned surviving in the streets. She was smaller, more agile, and, most importantly, more desperate. But she was also getting tired. Isabella's claws caught her arm on the fifth pass, opening 3 long gashes. Jane bit back a scream and kept moving. "First blood to Lady Isabella," Arthur called out, satisfaction in his voice. Jane ignored him, ignored the pain, ignored the blood running down her arm. She focused on Isabella, watching, waiting. Shifters were powerful, but that power came at a cost. They burned energy faster, got overconfident, relied on their natural advantages. And Isabella was getting frustrated. Her attacks were becoming less controlled, more aggressive. She was using more strength, moving faster, burning through her energy reserves. Jane kept dodging, kept moving, leading Isabella in circles around the arena, making her work for every attack. "Stand still and fight," Isabella snarled. "Why?" Jane panted. "So you can kill me faster? Not interested." Another attack, another dodge. But this time, Jane didn't run. She'd been waiting for this, the moment when Isabella's frustration overcame her training. Isabella lunged, putting all her strength behind a killing blow. And Jane, instead of dodging backward, dropped to the ground and swept Isabella's legs. It was a move that should never have worked on a shifter. But Isabella was off balance, moving too fast, her momentum working against her. She went down hard. Jane didn't hesitate. She threw herself on Isabella's back, wrapping her arm around the shifter's throat in a chokehold she'd seen street fighters use. Isabella thrashed, claws raking at Jane's arms, drawing more blood. But Jane held on with the desperate strength of someone who had everything to lose. "Yield," Jane gasped in Isabella's ear. "Never." "Then we'll both pass out. And when the guards pull us apart, we'll do this again tomorrow. And the day after. And the day after that." Jane tightened her grip, black spots dancing in her vision from pain and exhaustion. "I'll fight you every day for the rest of my life if I have to. Will you?" Isabella's struggles were weakening. Not from the chokehold. Jane wasn't strong enough to truly hurt her. But from exhaustion and the sudden, shocking realization that she might actually lose. "Yield," Jane repeated. "Please. I don't want to hurt you. I just want to be with the man I love. Is that really worth dying for?" For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, so quietly the crowd almost missed it, Isabella rasped, "I yield." Jane released her immediately and rolled away, her entire body shaking. Blood covered her arms from Isabella's claws, and she was pretty sure she'd pulled something in her shoulder. But she was alive. The courtyard exploded into chaos. Cheers from some, angry protests from others. But through it all, Jane heard only one voice. "Jane." Henry was there, crushing her against his chest, his hands frantically checking her injuries. "You're hurt? You're bleeding. We need to get you to the healers." "I'm okay," Jane said, and started to laugh. It was probably hysteria, but she couldn't help it. "Henry, I'm okay. I won." "We won." He pulled back to look at her, and there were tears streaming down his face. "You magnificent, terrifying, impossible woman. Don't you ever scare me like that again." "No promises." He kissed her there in the courtyard, in front of the entire kingdom, and Jane kissed him back despite her injuries, despite the scandal, despite everything. When they finally broke apart, Arthur was standing nearby, his face purple with rage. "This proves nothing," he sputtered. "She won through trickery, not strength. This is enough." Henry's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. He turned to address the crowd, still holding Jane against his side. Jane has proven her worth through courage, intelligence, and determination. She faced an opponent who should have killed her in seconds and found a way to win. That is the mark of a true queen. Not bloodline or power, but the strength of spirit to face impossible odds and prevail. He looked at the council, at the nobles, at every person who'd doubted them. Jane is my chosen mate, my queen, and anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me personally. No one moved. No one dared. I thought not. Henry looked down at Jane and his expression softened. Now, let's get you to the healers before you collapse. Always so romantic, Jane murmured, but she was smiling. As they walked back to the palace, Jane leaning heavily on Henry, her injuries finally catching up with her, she heard the whispers starting again. But this time, they were different. Did you see how she fought? She never gave up, even bleeding. Maybe the king is right. Maybe she is worthy. Change, Jane realized, didn't happen all at once. It happened in moments like these. Small victories that shifted perspectives, challenged assumptions, and opened possibilities. It was a start. The wedding took place 1 month later on the first day of spring. It wasn't the grand political spectacle the council had originally envisioned. There were no international delegations, no elaborate ceremonies designed to impress foreign powers. Instead, it was held in the palace gardens, open to anyone who wished to attend. Noble or commoner, shifter or human. And thousands came. Jane walked down the aisle in a gown of white and silver, her mother crying tears of joy in the front row beside Thomas, who looked uncomfortable in formal clothes but smiled at his sister with fierce pride. The scars on Jane's arms from the duel had healed, but she'd insisted they not be magically removed. They were part of her story now, proof of what she'd endured. Henry waited at the altar, and when she reached him, the look in his eyes made her breath catch all over again. "Ready?" he murmured. "Ready," she confirmed. The ceremony was a blend of shifter traditions and human customs, a symbolic union not just of two people, but of two worlds learning to coexist. When they exchanged vows, Jane spoke not just to Henry, but to the entire kingdom. "I stand before you not because I'm special, or powerful, or more deserving than anyone else. I stand here because one man saw past the barriers we build between ourselves and chose to see me as I truly am. I promise to honor that gift by working every day to build a kingdom where everyone, regardless of birth or species, has the chance to be seen, to be valued, to matter." There wasn't a dry eye in the audience. When Henry kissed his new queen, the crowd erupted into cheers that could be heard throughout Oakhaven. The North Wing was no longer a prison. Jane stood at the window of what had once been Henry's isolated study, watching the city below. So much had changed in 5 years. The lower city had been rebuilt, with new housing for human families and programs to ensure no child went hungry. The laws had been reformed to give humans equal rights and representation on the council, though that battle had taken 3 years of constant fighting. Mixed couples, human and shifter, were no longer rare, no longer scandalous. It wasn't perfect. There was still prejudice, still resistance from the old guard. But progress was being made, one day at a time. "There you are." Jane turned to find Henry in the doorway, and her heart still skipped at the sight of him. Some things never changed. "Just thinking," she said. "About?" "About that first night I walked through these doors, terrified and desperate, with no idea that my entire life was about to change." She smiled. "About a broken king and an invisible girl who somehow found each other in the dark." Henry crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "We weren't broken. We were just unfinished. And now? Now we're a work in progress. Together." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Speaking of together, are you ready for the council meeting? They're going to push back on the new education proposal." "Let them push. We'll push harder." Jane turned in his arms to face him. "We didn't come this far to give up now." "No." Henry agreed, looking at her with the same wonder he'd had 5 years ago. We didn't. As they left the North Wing together, king and queen, shifter and human, two people who'd defied every rule to find each other, Jane thought about that frightened girl who'd once believed she was nobody important. She'd been wrong about so many things back then. But the most important lesson she'd learned wasn't about crowns or kingdoms or changing the world. It was simpler than that. Everyone matters. Everyone has value. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to be invisible. To stand up, speak out, and insist on being seen. Even when the whole world tells you you're not enough, you stand anyway. And if you're very lucky, you find someone who's been standing in the darkness too, waiting for someone brave enough to turn on the light. And that, my friends, is the story of Jane. The invisible girl who became a queen not through power or birthright, but through courage, love, and the refusal to accept the limitations the world tried to place on her. I hope her story touched your heart the way it touched mine. I hope it reminded you that you matter, that your voice deserves to be heard, and that love, real love, sees past all the barriers we build between ourselves. If this story moved you, if you felt something during this hour we spent together, I need you to do something for me right now. Hit that like button. Show me this story resonated with you. Drop a comment telling me your favorite moment. Was it the first kiss? The trial by combat? The wedding? I want to hear from you. And if you haven't already subscribed, what are you waiting for? This channel is dedicated to bringing you stories that will make you feel, make you think, and remind you why storytelling matters. We have so many more tales to tell. Stories of love and courage, of impossible odds and triumphant hearts, of people who refuse to give up even when the world told them they should. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. Thank you for spending this time with me in Oakhaven. Thank you for believing in Jane and Henry. Thank you for being here. Until next time, remember, you are not invisible. You matter. And your story, whatever it is, deserves to be told.